About once a week, I get a DM or an email from somebody with a YouTube link in it, and they're going, how do I sound like that? Well, today we are going to give you a 3 or 4 step process for nailing the tone that another artist has. Okay, so let's get started. First thing you got to do is you got to have a target. We got to have a thing that we're aiming for. Then we're going to identify what is the main effect that person is using in their sound. We're going to sort of try to find any other side effects, any other side effects that they're using. And then we want to try to get the EQ just right, okay? So having a target is important. You can't hit something if you don't know exactly what it is that you're trying to hit. If you're just kind of firing into space, the chances that you're going to hit something are kind of low. So we're going to try to find recordings of that sound, and the best way is to get it as isolated as possible. If you can find a section of the song or the video where the background music's fairly low and the instrument, the tone that you're trying to nail is really exposed, that's the best thing. And maybe sort of loop that and really get it into your ears. Maybe even record that section, because you're going to keep going back to that section as a reference. If you're having a hard time finding an isolated section of that tone, maybe the song is just really full and it never drops down, it just leaves the violin hanging out there, you can find other songs that artist does. Most artists only have a couple of different tones that they really, really lean on. And chances are, if you're going to hear that tone in one song, you're going to hear that tone in another song. So if you're not finding in the song that you heard, this particular artist has this sound, go find some of their other songs, and at some point, I bet you're going to find that there's a fairly isolated or exposed section where they're playing, and you can get a recording of that section, right? Now, I do want to say we've got to set realistic expectations. Okay, you're probably not going to sound exactly like Mark Wood. You know why you're not going to sound exactly like Mark Wood? You're not Mark Wood. So technique is a huge chunk of tone. If Mark were to come in here and pick up my violin and run it through my rig, you know what he would sound like? He would sound like Mark Wood playing through my rig. So technique is probably 70%, 80% of what your sound is. Tone comes from here and here. Okay, so technique is a huge chunk of tone. If you are not that artist, you're not ever going to sound exactly like that artist. Gear is another huge chunk of tone. So I could say, well, it's a distortion patch that he's using, but there are zillions of distortion patches. If you want to get as close as you can to a certain sound, you're probably going to want to dig out at least something similar to the same kind of gear that artist is using. So if they're using a zoom pedal, or they're using a helix, or they're using stomp boxes or whatever, you may want to start hitting in that direction. Settings are the very last piece. It's the last 10% of what a sound is. So let's keep our expectations realistic. Does that mean that if I hear a Caitlin DeVille, am I going to be able to sound somewhat like that, like quite a bit like that? Yeah, probably. But let's just keep our expectations realistic, okay? So the first thing we want to do is identify the main effect that is in that sound. Is it a distortion sound? Is it a pitch shifting sound? Is it a filter? Is it a mod? So we got to decide what is taking up the bulk, what effect is doing the bulk of the work in the sound that you're listening to. That takes time. It's going to take time with you experimenting with different effects. And it's just, there are no shortcuts around this. Sending me an email can't just cut 100 hours out of the process of you just getting into your ear what a little bit of distortion sounds like, or a medium amount of distortion, or a lot of distortion, or like a little bit of an auto wah, or a lot of an auto wah, or a backwards auto wah. So you're gonna have to sit and just monkey with these effects. That's why I like to recommend for people who are fairly new to effects to get a multi-effects pedal, something like maybe the Boss ME80, that has a ton of different effects in it. And you can spend time working with the vibrato effect, and you go, man, I don't think I'm ever going to use that. That's fine, but the more you spend time with that particular effect, the more your ears are going to recognize when you listen to another recording. You go, oh, they're using a vibrato effect on that. So it's a thing that you got to train your ears to do, just like you're training your ears to learn how to play the instrument or play in tune. You're going to have to train yourself to learn what different effects sound like. The beauty thing in the world of social media, a lot of times you can ask the artist. You know, if you found this Patrick Contreras sound that you like, hey, Patrick's pretty active on social media. You're like, man, how did you get that sound? You can send him a note, and there's a decent chance he's going to respond, and he's going to tell you how he got that sound. Artists are a lot more accessible now than they used to be. So once we've discovered the main effect, okay, we got distortion. I'm hearing there's distortion in there, but it's not the only thing I'm hearing. It's very seldom as an artist go, okay, I'm going to put one effect on there, and then that's my sound. So now we've got to discover the other effects that are behind that. So once we've got the distortion and we've got that, okay, it's a warm distortion. I've got it dialed in about, I'm sort of monkeying with how much distortion, and I'm getting closer. And remember, we're going to keep going back and forth between our sound and the reference sound. And then one of the guys that taught me the most that I know about sound, he goes, hey man, it's a knob, turn it. If it makes it sound worse, turn it the other way. So if you've decided, yes, it is a distortion sound, well then turn it. And if your sound now sounds more like the reference, well, keep turning it until it starts sounding less like the reference, and then go back. It sounds kind of dumb, but that's exactly how we do this. So, all right, the secondary effects, what are we going to do? There's generally some reverb, there's generally some delay, and there are a bunch of different reverbs and a bunch of different delays. So you're going to experiment with those until you find just, how much reverb, how much delay they've got in there. There are also often phasers and flangers that are blended in pretty low, maybe 5 or 10%, just to add a little bit of width or some thickness to that sound. Sometimes there's an octave in there, they just dial in a little bit to make it sound a little fatter. And the more you experiment with these things, the more you're going to hear them quickly. You're going to go, okay, yeah, it's distortion. There's a little bit of reverb and an octave in there. Chorus, wah, both of these things, they're all things that are generally used a little bit, just enough to sort of just touch the edges of that sound and maybe thicken it up or fatten it up some. Again, it takes time. You're going to have to experiment with these things. There are no shortcuts. And like I said before, if you're stumped, a lot of times you can hit up the artist on social media and they will respond to you. All right, the last thing we want to do is we want to get the EQ. Once we've sort of got the character of that sound that we're trying to nail, then we're gonna go back and forth between the reference and our sound, and that's when we're gonna try to get the EQ of this thing right. And we're gonna is their sound, and it's similar, but my sound's just a little brighter than theirs. I can pull some highs out. If their sound's a little warmer than mine, man, I can dial in some mids or some low mids. Is it thicker? Sometimes that's going to be some lows, but sometimes it's not going to be EQ. Maybe I've got to go back and think, well, maybe they use a little bit of chorus to widen that thing out, or a little bit of a stereo flanger to widen that thing out. So that's going to be sort of your secondary effects and EQ if we're into that section on thicker. So just keep going back and forth between your sound and the reference sound, and keep adding things to it. And if you're getting further away, then try something different. Authenticity, though, is the key. One of the things that you'll hear a sound from somebody and like, man, I really like that sound. The problem is you don't really play anything like that. If you're a fairly clean, classically trained kind of player and you hear this really cool heavy distortion sound, does that sound really stylistically appropriate to what you're doing? The thing is, you are going to sound like you no matter what you do. So if it sounds kind of fake and I've got this real heavy like auto wah sound and now I'm going to go play some Paganini, and it just doesn't work. There's not an authenticity to it. It just doesn't feel right. Then I appreciate the sound that they got and I'm glad that I was able to match it, but is it really me? A lot of times this heavy distortion you put on there, there's a certain attitude that usually needs to accompany that heavy distortion. You can't just click distortion on and then it does all the work of making something sound rock and roll. The way you play is what makes something sound rock and roll. So if you don't have a rock and roll bone in your body, then maybe just throwing distortion on and playing some Bach isn't really the right thing to do. All right, so I hope that's been helpful in figuring out when we listen to a sound, what is my process for going after how I'm going to duplicate that sound. If you got any questions, you can always hit us up at Electric Violin Shop. All the socials are here, and you can reach us there. If you've got questions about specific stuff, you can reach out, and we can try to help you. But that's the basic process, okay? So thank you guys for listening.